Hello, I'm Ed Rabyd, otherwise known as the Rabyd Atheist, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you would like. The purpose of this channel is educational, particularly in regards to deconversion issues and atheist issues in regards to the Bible and theology. I mostly deal with people that have deconverted from Christianity, but any religion has certain common elements that deconversion is an issue. If you have deconverted and become a free thinker of some sort, consider this your safe haven. Today I want to continue in my series, A Tall Tale of Jesus, but I want to go a little different direction. But firstly, I'm going to remind you about this series that the main issue with The Tall Tale of Jesus is to take on the claim that Christians make that the Gospels constitute four separate witnesses of Jesus' life and thus constitute four witnesses. The first basic criteria that I'm using is the very biblical criteria that says, in the mouth of two or three witnesses, let everything be established. So far in this series, we have not been able to establish more than one witness for any event. Even events that have multiple accounts from the different Gospels are obviously copied from the original Gospel Mark, and this becomes a real problem. In many cases, when Matthew or Luke don't copy Mark and add their own material, the material is unique, which means Mark doesn't have it, Luke doesn't have it, or John doesn't have it if Matthew does. If Luke has it, then Mark doesn't have it, neither does Matthew or John. So those stand as one witnesses as well. We have actually not seen two separate witnesses of anything. The other criteria, of course, is any other oddity that kind of draws attention to the idea that perhaps the text is not inerrant and thus not infallible. Today, though, I want to go in a different direction. I want to consolidate some thoughts we've had up to this time on maybe be a little bit more clearer about the idea of oral tradition, about the synoptic problem, and why this creates problems for our criteria of witnesses. Now, I want to talk about oral tradition. Now, oral tradition in its simplest form is how the stories of Jesus lasted so long. Now, I have granted the conservative Christians their claim that all the Gospels have been written in the first century, although personally I do not believe that is true, and I personally think that that's a very risky scholarly opinion to take. You have to really stretch reality and the probabilities of reality to make that true given the text that we possess currently. But let's say, fine, we'll let them have their stretches. I've also granted the authorship that Matthew, the tax collector, wrote Matthew, although that's going to present some interesting problems later. That Mark wrote Mark. This would be John Mark, one of the disciples of Jesus, in particular the one that ran off naked during the Garden of Gethsemane story. And then you have Luke, the beloved physician, who was not an eyewitness of events, but according to his preamble, he searched everything out carefully to put an orderly account. But the question becomes an orderly account of what? The actual events of Jesus, or all these oral traditions floating around, and he's trying to put some sort of order and make some sense of them. I think the latter is probably the more reasonable assumption, and he actually creates more problems than he solves when you really look at it from a scholarly point of view. John claims that he's writing these things so that you would know how to have eternal life, and that believing in his name, Jesus' name, will bring you that eternal life. You know, the dating of these, if we let the conservative Christians have their way, is, 40 to 50 AD for Mark, in the 60s for Matthew and Luke, and, about 90 AD for John. That's the conservative Christian estimate, which I think is pushing it a little bit, given the text we have and what we know about textual criticism. So before these dates, what preserved all the stories of Jesus? Oral tradition. People heard stories, passed it on, anecdotal evidence. I want to simply put to you the fact that what preserved these things was stories told over and over and over. And this creates a problem because all the eyewitnesses of those stories would have eventually become muddled. This will lead into the synoptic problem, but here's the basic problem with eyewitnesses. If eyewitnesses aren't separated at a crime scene, they eventually start to collude with each other and come up with a single monolithic story that may or may not have truth to it. In fact, often it reshades the story and makes it a little bit different. It becomes the first building block in collusion, and thus the first building block in any stories that are told later. And any stories, particularly of a miraculous nature, tend to get bigger and bigger, particularly when you have competing gods. Jesus' story of miracles in Mark, for instance, is very low-key. Matthew and Luke, the miracles get a little bit bigger and they get a little bit brighter. And then, of course, in John, they're just off the chain. John creates a superhero out of Jesus. He would, in this day and age, it's the third version of Jesus, and he's even more super and spectacular than the Amazing Spider-Man. That's kind of the way it would work. The problem with oral tradition and having time with oral tradition is a legend begins to grow. You actually see this in all the copies of the Gospels that we actually have. The 4 Gospels that are canonical are actually somewhere in the middle. The early Gospels mostly consist of Jesus' teachings. I think those may actually be more authentic than the Gospels that we have, because I can prove an earlier writing for them in some cases, in which case those Gospels would, because they have other problems, are not considered very good scholarship. However, they would be closer to the person Jesus and thus might actually preserve his teachings very well. This is what leads me to think that Jesus is a growing legend and not a myth. I'm not personally a mythicist with Jesus of Nazareth. I, however, do think that what Jesus of Nazareth was probably a very unique teacher, and perhaps this is what made his followers so devoted to him. And then when perhaps the Romans did indeed kill him, maybe crucify him as maybe an insurrectionist falsely, they created an entire narrative blaming the Jews and so on and so forth. What I'm pointing out to you with all this story is this, that the oral tradition has a way of getting out of hand like a game of telephone. The more a story is told, there's 2 things that happen. One, fantastic elements get added over time, and then those fantastic elements get encased and enstoned in the story because of collusion. Collusion makes the story more unified, and that's a problem. Because as we lead into the synoptic gospel and the synoptic problem, here's what the synoptic problem is. It's what is well known to most Bible scholars. I studied it when I was in Bible college and seminary. But the synoptic problem basically goes something like this. We know that there's a major amount of collusion between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because not only are many parts of those documents written exactly word for word, we're very, very sure that Matthew and Luke, the writers of those Gospels, copied Mark almost verbatim. But here's the additional problem. The problem that happened is this. Number one, Jesus would have spoken and all these things would have taken place in Aramaic. Now, the problem is the Gospels are written in Greek. So not only do we have a possible collusion of Aramaic speech, but when we finally get to the Gospel writings, not only are they word for word, they're word for word in Greek, which means they're a word for word translation. Now, I have translated Greek New Testament, and I was amazed all the time that how different people would pick up different nuances of different words. We would go around the room after a Greek translation, and we would often find that we all had differences in how we looked at the text or how we translated certain words, and so the translations would be different. We would then sit down in that class and go over that, and eventually we would come up with a final translation that was a collusive effort between all of our efforts, thus illustrating the very problem that we have. Not only is it probable that by the time the oral tradition does get handed down and recorded and preserved by Mark, and other traditions recorded by Matthew and Luke and John, these traditions have had a long time to collude, and by translating them into Greek, we now have a collusion where we're even saying that the translation is the same. It thus becomes very clear that Matthew and Luke copied great chunks of Mark, almost word for word from the Greek, which indicates a double collusion. It's really bad. Now, you would say, well, what difference does that make? That means that the story can't be really the story. It means that Matthew and Luke are not really separate witnesses at all of those events. They actually are doing nothing more than copying Mark. And that just doesn't really help us, does it? Because it means that we don't really have two or three witnesses with the Synoptic Gospels. What we have is one, and that one witness is copied over and over and over again. Just because you copy something over and over again doesn't make it true. Just because you say something over and over again doesn't make it true. That's how propaganda gets done. This also will lead, of course, to, well, what about John? Well, the problem with John is he deliberately seems to stand alone. He deliberately seems to avoid everything that the Synoptic Gospels even talk about. There are very few events that he even deals with that the Synoptics deal with. It becomes a real muddled mess with John. As Johannine literature gets added, John is basically literally a single witness of all the events, of many of the events that he records. And he doesn't have a lot of the events that the other Gospel writers have. This becomes a real common problem. Why the Gospels don't stand as two or three witnesses philosophically at this point is very simple. Mark stands as his own witness. Any part that Matthew and Luke copy, well, it's still Mark's witness. And any part that Matthew copies, that Matthew adds with his own additions, well, you have the problem of then it's only Matthew's witness, not Mark's, not Luke's, not John's. So it's a single witness of that particular part of the event. Now, there are some things, and the same goes for Luke. Now, there are some things that Luke and Matthew share that don't appear in Mark. And it is for this reason that we believe another mysterious gospel known as Q existed. The vast majority of this, however, I think is the teachings of Jesus, which we kind of go back to those original gospels before the four that were pretty much a preservation of the words of Jesus Christ. Maybe one of them was used in the original Greek. And those are often word for word, which means that's a collusive effort too. The short story is that the Gospels are a collusion, not a recording of witnesses. They're a recording of oral tradition that's been colluded and added to and diluted, and things have been put in and taken out. And yet at the same time, by the time you get it down to it, it's so similar, and that is the real problem. It tells me, and it tells every other honest scholar, that a great deal of effort was made by the gospel writers to gain some sort of conformity, while at the same time preserving their unique nature to a small degree. That's a real problem, because it means not only did collusion take place, it took place on multiple levels over a great deal of period of time. The real Jesus is lost in the growing legend, and John is not helpful to the case at all. In fact, we literally have to look at John sometimes with a grain of salt. One of the most popular stories in John, for instance, is the woman caught in adultery. There's a double problem with this. Not only is John the only one who records it, thus only one witness, but it's also clear that it's a later addition to the John's Gospel, like several centuries later. And that is just simply proven as the earliest copies of John that we have don't have the story, and it doesn't appear until much later. This means that this was another bit of oral tradition that had been floating around for hundreds of years, and some pious believer decided it belonged in John, and it belonged in at this point, and he added it. This doesn't speak well of something that is inerrant and has a guided hand of God process. It looks more like human beings colluded, built legends, grew the legend until it became larger than life. This is why none of this stands as two or three witnesses. I could literally go, and I am going to continue on this series and literally show how this is so all the way through the Gospels. It gets even more fun when I'm going to hit the resurrection, because the resurrection doesn't appear in Mark, and the other three Gospels are so unique they hardly ever overlap, which means there's only one Mark's witness of the resurrection is non-existent. Matthew's is unique. Luke's is unique. And John's is unique, which means they're all single witnesses, which means there really isn't two or three witnesses that confirm certain things about the resurrection of Jesus. There is a small amount of overlap in a certain few things, but those are contradictory most of the time, and that makes it even worse. The reason I'm saying all this now is because I want you to understand that I have enough evidence already to dismiss the Gospels as two or three or four witnesses of the events of Jesus Christ. I've studied the life of Christ so many times, I now know this is so painfully true. It is one of the reasons why I left my faith, and I realized I had no more reason to believe anything in the Gospels than I had reason to believe in Paul Bunyan. The fact of the matter is the stories have gotten stretched, they've been colluded over time, they have been preserved in such a way that further collusion has happened. When additions have happened, those additions are colluded oral tradition that have just been added, like the woman caught in the adultery. And over time, it becomes very clear that John has no desire to be any kind of witness but his own witness to his own events. And the Synoptic Gospels, well, most of it's just Mark reporting oral tradition that the other two copied. And the other oral traditions that are preserved in Matthew and Luke, some of it is obviously word for word from another source. And the things that are truly unique in Matthew don't appear in Luke. And the things that are truly unique in Luke don't appear in Matthew. And neither of those unique things in Matthew or Luke appear in the other two Gospels. Literally, every case that I came up with when I tried to do this before as a Christian, I discovered very painfully and very obviously that there weren't two or three or four witnesses of the events of Jesus Christ. Each person is telling their own tale, and that tale is an old one. Long before it hits paper, a colluded old story that has obviously had some legend building behind it. And now it's just more collusion, more additions, more stuff, but not two or three witnesses. And the Gospels fail in their own criteria, their own biblical criteria of two or three witnesses establishing everything. I'm also in this video. Now, I am going to continue this series, but I want to let you know that this is where I stand at this point, and the evidence is overwhelming. I'm simply going to do this demonstration to demonstrate how this is so for the rest of the life of Christ. I've already gone over the life of Christ probably 7 or 8 times in my ministry, and every time I ran into this problem, and it just isn't going away. The fact is, for those of you who believe in Jesus Christ, you believe a story, perhaps, of a guy named Jesus of Nazareth who may have been a rabbi who had some unique teachings, whose disciples, because of perhaps the way he was killed, and perhaps he was an innocent man that was killed, decided to go after the people that killed him. Perhaps the Jews did consider him a threat, and they got rid of him. And since then, the disciples of Jesus, over time, built up his legend, added miracles, made up things. I think the resurrection is a made-up story. I think ultimately, people say, well, there is no body. Well, there wouldn't be an identifiable body if crucifixion victims are handled the way that crucifixion victims were always handled at that time period. In short, Jesus' body would have been thrown into a mass grave with a bunch of other victims until the pit got full, and then it would have been buried over. This means Jesus' body wouldn't be identifiable. You wouldn't be able to do it. Oh, but he was put in a tomb. That's a problematic story. I'm going to add a little video here at the end. Apologia recently did a review of several apologists talking about this and the synoptic problem. And I'll link that above my head. It's a good read, a good listen, and a good watch. But he will further talk about the case of that. And I wanted to give a shout out to him for getting me along this line of reasoning. And I felt it was overdue that this video should be done for the tall tale of Jesus. Now, I want to thank you all for stopping by and listening to an old preacher who's now an atheist who now realizes the BS that is Christianity, talking to you about it. And hopefully you'll take some of it to heart if you are a Christian, because I really don't think you should waste your time with something that is obviously more mythology and more stories. I want to thank you once again for stopping by the channel. Like, subscribe, do the things that you do. Hit your notification bell for more content as it is released if you like what you've heard. And hopefully someday I can convince you to be a rabid atheist like myself. In the meantime, this is Ed Rabyd, the Rabid Atheist, signing off and wishing you a good day.